In this lesson, we're going to talk about Zbrush to Photoshop. This is the process that you'll follow if you want to take your rendered images out of ZBrush and then bring them into Photoshop, composite render passes, and create highly polished presentation imagery. Now, you would do this in a concept art pipeline. You might potentially want to do this to present your work in the best possible light to a supervisor, a director, or an art director. There's many different reasons why you would want to export passes of your geometry from ZBrush. The most important thing is when you render passes, it gives you total control over things like your lighting and your shadows and your translucency. It breaks up the different elements that make up your image into individual layers that you can load into Photoshop and then have more control over the final product. It's generally how all final imagery is created in a digital pipeline. It's always composited. There's always post-processing. So let's take a look at how we do this. I'm going to cover two different methods in this video. The first method is going to be found under the Z plugin menu here, and that is the ZBrush to Photoshop plugin. Now, this automates the process of rendering different passes and then sending them to Photoshop. It creates a layer for each one, sets up the blending mode for you, and it also creates smart layers, which can be really handy for editing. I'm also going to show you how to do this manually, how you can render individual passes, export them, and then load them into Photoshop and then set the compositing layers. The reason I do both is because I used to always just teach the manual process before this plugin existed. Then I found when this plugin was introduced, I started teaching this in my class, and the students were kind of confused about what the layers were doing. So if you at least once do the entire process manually, you'll understand better how a shadow pass works or how a specular pass works and how the blending modes in Photoshop work together to make it work. So we'll start by using ZBrush to Photoshop. Now, here I have the bogey lady loaded up. She has multiple subtools here. There's a body and teeth. I have mesh extractions here that I'm using for drool, and that's rendered with a glass shader. Now, if you want to know how to set up these materials, be sure to watch the video on materials and rendering in ZBrush where we talk about this. The eyes have two different subtools. I have an outer shell here. If I were to just move the model, it'll drop out of this best preview render that I've created. And you can see there's an outer shell for the eyes that have a reflective material on there. If I turn off the outer shell, you can see that there is an inner eye which has the sclera and the iris and the pupil. That's what gives us that corneal bulge and the reflections around the surface of the eye. I also have a hair folder here where I have fiber mesh objects, and then I have a section of eyelashes down here. So I've got a separate folder for eyelashes and a folder for body hair. So this will work with folders. It will work with every single subtool that's visible. If I turn anything off, for example, I have the hair turned off. See, I've got hair along the edge. If I turn that off again, that will not be included in my renders. So you can selectively show and hide different elements that you want to be present in your render. Now, I have also set my document resolution. You'll notice that this is not the proportion of the standard ZBrush document. What we do is we go into the settings here and we can turn off proportional and then change our height and width. And what I did was simply set it to 1024 by 768, which is too low resolution, but it's an easy number to remember. Oops, here we go, 1024 by 768. The tab key is not working. 1024 and then tab to the next one. There we go, by 768. Now if I click resize, it will tell me it's going to, it's not undoable. I'll say yes. And that gives me this orientation here, which is landscape. Now, if I want this to be portrait, I would just swap those values out. So I'd set it to 768 by 1024. And then resize. Again, I'll tell it yes, and now we have portrait. Now this is too low resolution. I want to increase this document resolution. So I will double size it twice. Then if I zoom out, I've got quite a large document. I'll draw my model on canvas, go into edit mode, and you'll notice I have my timeline up here and I have 2 camera hotkeys. So you can position your model on canvas and then set hotkeys for it. If you accidentally move your model, then you can use the left-right arrow keys and it will snap back into the correct position. So this is really handy when you're setting up your render file to have these. That way you can always come back and get the exact same image rendered out with different materials. Under lighting, I have set up my lighting with 3 lights here. I've got some rim light and a bit of fill light. And then the materials are set up for each individual part. And as I said, we will talk about how to set up these materials in the materials and rendering section. Suffice to say that I've got my materials set up in a manner in which I want them to be displayed. On the body, I am using what I have in this project as basic material 5. If I change that material, you see it changes on the body. So that's important because we're going to use alternate materials here. And we want ZBrush to be able to swap that material out if required. So that's our document setup. It's very important when you're at this high resolution. If you're having a hard time navigating, it can be quite slow if it's a very, very dense mesh. Make sure if we go to the body and select the body, for example, this is the densest of all my subtools. You can step down your resolution and then you can navigate easier. But when you're working at such a high resolution, you can use these buttons here and this will zoom into the actual document and let you move around and look at different areas and sculpt on areas or paint on areas that you might want to touch up before your final render. If I click the actual size, it shows me the actual resolution on screen, which is too big to see. Anti-aliased half gives me an anti-aliased half-size version, which is still too big, so then I can just manually zoom out to see my full document. This is not going to impact the BPR render resolution. That is set with the document here, so it's going to come out at this resolution. Couple other things I'd like to touch on, those extraction objects that I have. Let me close out of the eyes and we'll come up here to the drool. These extraction objects that I have here, these are the drool objects. They have a glass material on there. And it's important to note that down here under the tool menu, under BPR settings, which you find under display properties. So if you open display properties, open BPR settings, you have a slider here for shadow. So I have transparency shading turned on. That's what allows that to be transparent. And shadow is turned down. If you have shadow turned on, your transparent objects will cast a shadow, which can, I find, give you unexpected results sometimes. So I like to turn that all the way down so my transparent, sort of glassy objects aren't casting shadows that cause weirdness in the render. Now, anything I have that's glass, like the outer shell of the eye, I have transparency turned on and I have the shadows turned off on those. So now we're ready to actually create our renders. Under the Zbrush to Photoshop plugin, you've got these buttons for these different render passes. These are essentially just going to be image layers that are rendered out of ZBrush that are composited together in Photoshop. So BPR gives you your BPR render pass. That's your beauty pass. Depth gives you a Z-depth pass. Now that means everything that's close to the camera will be white, everything going away from the camera will be going towards black. Now you can use that to help create lens blur, like focal length, focal distance inside of Photoshop. You can use it for atmospheric perspective. You can use it to make areas close to the viewer sort of more saturated. While they fall away, they can fall into shadow or fall into less saturated color. There's really no limit to what you can do with a depth pass, and it can be very handy to have that. Mask is just an overall mask of the silhouette of the character. Polygroup ID will give you what's called a clown pass. That's just a flat color for each polygroup. And shadow will give you the shadows. So we will render with just these basic layers to start with. Now, before we start, we have a clear layer cache button here and a application path button. If I clear layer cache, it will get rid of any stored layers that I've rendered out previously. Now, if you do this, be aware that it's going to break the smart layers in any open ZBrush document that you have at that time. So if I've rendered passes out from ZBrush and then I'm using those smart layers, this will break those smart layers. And smart layers allow you to make edits to a layer that are non-destructive. You can always revisit that edit layer and change that back to what it was originally. And we'll see that in action when we get into Photoshop. Just be aware that if you do delete your caches, it can break that. And you would only clear your caches if it's taking up a lot of space, or maybe things are starting to behave in unexpected ways. Now, the R button you'll press to set the application path for Photoshop. So if you try and run the Send to Photoshop CC and it doesn't know where Photoshop is, you just click this button, browse to your Photoshop executable on disk, and then click on it, and that will set the path to Photoshop. So with these selected, I will click Send to Photoshop CC. Now it's going to go through all the visible subtools. Anything that's hidden will not be rendered. It may still cycle through the subtool names at the top of your screen, but it's not going to bother rendering those. And it's going to create each one of those passes and then write out a cache file for it. And then when it's complete, it will pop up with a message from Photoshop asking if we want to run a script. And we're going to say yes to that. But because this is such a high resolution document, it's going to take a little bit of time for these to render. So I will pause the video and we'll come back when it's finished rendering these passes, because it's not much to watch right now. It's just the status bar at the top of the screen as it cycles through each render. And then when that's complete, we'll come back and we'll take a look at how we go into Photoshop. So the script is now completed, and if we go over to Photoshop, you'll see we have a script window here that's telling us we're about to run a script contained in this file. So just say yes, that's ZBrush running the script to create your Photoshop document. Now when we click yes, you can see it start to build the various layers and groups here. So it's going to load in each one of the renders from the cache and then assemble it together for you with all the blending modes set up. So going from the top, we have a top group, which are all of your renders. We turn that off. Everything goes away except for the background. If we double click the background, we can change our background color here. If we turn back on our master layers, you can see that we're now sitting against a backdrop. We have a masks group, and the masks group contains the masks for the character. And these are live layers, so these you can double click on these and actually add edits to them. We'll take a look at that in just a second. Here we've got our shadow pass, and the shadow pass here is automatically set to the multiply layer blending mode at 50% opacity. So this is automatically set up. You could potentially increase the opacity on this if you wanted to, or decrease it depending. So let's set that back to 50. Oops, let me go ahead and set that back to 50 and hit enter. There we are. I'll collapse that layer, and here we have geometry, and in geometry we have the renders that are based on our geometry. So we have polygroup ID, and this is a clown pass. So if we turn off our effects, we can see this is just flat color for each individual subtool or each individual tool. So everything that's got a polygroup will have a separate color assigned to it. So the teeth were all polygrouped separately, so these will all have a different color. This will facilitate, for example, the magic wand. If you wanted to make a selection of just the skin, you could easily do so. Or if you wanted to select just the eyes, you could easily do so. We also have our depth pass here, which I mentioned. Everything that is white is close to the camera. Everything dark is moving away from the camera. We'll turn off visibility on that group and collapse it. The lights we haven't rendered yet. We'll do that in our next pass. Materials we haven't rendered yet. These are custom materials. And then we have our base layers, which is the base render here. Now, if I select this and let's say I press Control L to bring up the levels control, I could level this, move that out of the way so you can see. So I could adjust these levels and make it quite stark. So if I adjust the levels on this and click OK, that is a non-destructive edit. Whereas if this were not the smart layer, it would be applied to the pixels. However, you see we have smart filters here. If I double click levels, I can bring this back where it was. So this is non-destructive. And that's the live linking that I was talking about before when I said if you delete your cache files, that can break, because this is referencing the original cache files. So we'll just set that back as it was and click OK. So these are the basic layers that we can render out. But if we go back to ZBrush, we can enable some others. So I'll turn on ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is a shadow pass that gives us a darker shadow in areas where the surfaces are closer together. It's the occlusion of light based on the surface's proximity to one another. Albedo is just your flat color. That is sort of analogous to applying a flat color material to an object, and it takes away the shading information and just gives you the flat color itself. Best Render is just a different rendering mode inside of ZBrush. The only reason you might want to use something like Best Render is if you're using some other rendering effects in ZBrush, like not fiber mesh, but there's ZBrush fibers. You might be using something like that. They're older look dev tools inside of ZBrush that rely on the Best Render mode instead of BPR. I never end up using Best Render anymore, so it's not something that really comes up for me, but that's why it's there. Color Bump generates a color bump pass. Lights, we'll turn that on. That generates lighting pass. That will be rendering each individual light. Now, if you want to change those lights, I'll show you where you go to do that. If you go to your ZBrush 2021 install folder, I'm going to have to actually minimize, well, not minimize, but reduce the size of my ZBrush screen here to bring this over. So here you can see is the ZBrush 2021 installation folder. If I go to Z Startup and Z Plugs 64, inside there we have ZBrush to Photoshop data. And here we have lights. And in the lights folder, these are the lights that will be rendered. You can change these or add to them just by changing lighting in your light menu in ZBrush and then saving that out as a Z light file. So we'll turn lights on, and that will render the lights that are in that folder. We can create an object space normal pass. Preview render pass is just the preview render. It's what you see inside of ZBrush. If you were to, say, adjust your preview shadow settings, so for example, if I go to render and go to preview shadows, I could turn the opacity down on my preview shadows, or I could turn it up, or I could change the length of my preview shadows. A lot of people don't know that this menu exists. If I turn up the length of my shadows, I can adjust just how dramatic the preview lighting actually is. I could turn this down, and I could turn this down to 0, and then we remove the preview shadows almost entirely. Let's go back to render and scroll down here. You can see that we have the option for flat shadow mode. We can change our depth and the slope. So there's a lot of opportunity to adjust your preview settings here. You can also adjust your preview wax settings. Now, we have a specular pass, which will allow us to isolate the specular shine, and that's very useful to have. We can generate a subsurface scattering pass. Subtool ID will give us a clown pass based on subtools. So whereas before we had polygroup ID, which gave us a flat color for each individual polygroup, this will give us a flat color for each individual subtool, which is very good to have. We can do subtool masks, which will make a mask for each subtool, which is, you can create that using the subtool ID, but subtool mask is a nice extra to have. We can do a tangent space normal map pass and wireframe if you want to show your wireframe. Now here we have custom materials. Now these are set by default to various materials and they are turned off by default. If I wanted to change the materials, let's say, for example, I wanted to see a pass using the Sculpey material, Matcap Sculpey, I would just click the Material 1 button, and it says this will replace the shiny material with the Matcap Sculpey, so say yes. And then you need to turn that on by clicking the box next to it. If I change to a different material now, let's say I want to do, this is really useful when you're doing hard surface. You can store a variety of metallic materials and paint materials, render them out as passes, and then selectively paint masks out to reveal one material and hide another. So maybe in this case, I want to put a metallic red on here, even though there's no real reason to make this creature metallic red. I'll click Material 3, say yes, and then turn that pass on. So with these turned on, I will send to Photoshop again, and it will once again render. And when it goes to Photoshop, it won't overwrite the existing document. It will create a brand new document for me. So I'm going to click Send to Photoshop, and once again, it will go through creating each individual render pass. Now this will take a bit more time because we are rendering ambient occlusion. The rest won't be too terribly difficult to render, but the ambient occlusion will add some render time. Now, one last thing before we render, we want to make sure we change our material back to the skin material we set up. Otherwise, the base render will carry that reflect red material and not the skin. And we set that reflect red up as an alternative material slot, so we already have that. Just to adjust the view, and now we're ready to click the script link, the ZBrush to Photoshop plugin button, and it will run through those renders, and we'll come back after it is completed and see how they stack together in Photoshop. And we're back in Photoshop. Once again, we get the warning, the script needs permission to run. We will click yes, and it will create a brand new document and then start to load all those passes together. Once again, it will group them, it will make smart layers from them, and it will also automatically set up your layer blending modes and your opacity. And it'll take a little bit longer this time because we have considerably more passes than we did before. And here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse all of these groups so we can look at each one of them one at a time. So we have our master group again. If we turn that off, then we're just seeing the background. We can double click the background and then change that color to anything that we want, or we can add a different background here. Turn our master group back on and then expand this and expand the masks. So we've got a master mask here. Oops. We have fiber mask. It's the fiber mesh eyelashes. There's one set, the next set, another set. We have the eyeballs as a mask. Here we have the inner eyes as a mask. Here you can see that we have one of our mesh extractions that we're using for drool as a mask, and another. And teeth, we have a mask for just the teeth. And we have a mask for the head. So we'll collapse that layer and turn off masks. Now, if we open effects, you can see that we have our ambient occlusion pass. The ambient occlusion gives us that nice sort of gradient shadow in the nooks and crannies. And if we select that layer, you can see that it's already set to multiply at 100%. The specular pass is already set to screen at 25%. The specular pass is essentially, if we turn this on to normal blending mode and 100%, you can see that this is just a chrome shader, which gives us reflectivity. It's very similar to what we did with the materials for the drool and the outer eyes, which again, we talk about in more depth in the chapter specifically on materials, but this just gives us a specular layer. And if we change this to screen again, and then dial back our opacity, then it appears to be a shine. Now, I'm going to show you a different way of making specular in the second part of this demonstration. So this is one method of doing it. Now we have our shadow pass, and the shadow pass just gives us total control over our shadows. It's automatically set to 50%. And remember, because we have a smart layer here, if I were to, say for example, I have this layer selected, if I press Control L and then I start to adjust the levels, maybe I want to crunch these down, make changes to them, click OK. That is non-destructive. I can turn that adjustment off by changing the visibility, or I can double click it and then access those settings once again to change them. So this is a really handy way of working, especially if you're finding your way through the process of compositing your layers and painting in Photoshop. You might find it really beneficial to have this type of non-destructive workflow so you can always go back and change things. You don't have to worry about if you're going to ruin something. So we will collapse our effects, turn visibility off on that, and open geometry. And these are the layers that are generated from geometry. So we have our subtool ID. This is a flat color material assigned to each individual subtool. So this is a clown pass. Often it's called a clown pass. This just allows you to easily take the layer and select it, take the magic wand tool, and then you can select based on color, like this. You could also do a select by color in Photoshop by going to Select, Color Range, and then sampling the color like this. You could sample color and then make your selection like so. Next, we have a polygroup ID. So this is each individual polygroup has a color code. So the teeth, once again, they have different polygroups for each tooth. The eyes have a different polygroup in the body. So those are color coded. And that's a really nice way to break up complex subtools that have a lot of different parts, but you don't want to break that into a whole bunch of different subtools. Then lastly, we have the depth pass. Depth, white is coming towards us, dark is going away. So this gives us a nice method of creating depth of field or atmospheric perspective. I will collapse the geometry group and turn off the visibility. Now we have the lights. Here we rendered those lights. So I've got a light coming from screen left. I have a light coming from left top right. This is the R right, but screen left. So let's go to top right. So we can turn these off and adjust them and make changes to them. And once again, it's very nice for the lighting to have these be smart filters. So if I were to like take this particular one, oops, this is set to screen. And if I take this and then let's say adjust our layers, or adjust our levels, I mean to say, we can crunch these levels down and start to get bloom, that nice lighting effect where you get like a real sharp, or not sharp, pardon me, you get a real fuzzy sort of bloom along the edge of your lighting there. If you have like a strong backlight. And then we could click OK on that, and that is a smart filter. So that's not sort of written stone. We can change that. I could also go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we could add some blur to that layer. And you see Gaussian Blur, that is non-destructive. If we have that smart layer turned off, that smart filter, I mean to say, turned off, it goes away. So we'll turn off visibility on that. You can see we have our other lights here. If I were to select this light and press Control U, I could change the color. I could colorize this light. I could make it purple, make it blue. I'm a big fan of sort of a blue rim light on a warm character. So we could increase the saturation, decrease the lightness. And once again, that is something we can turn on and off as required. So we'll close the lights, turn off visibility on that, and open our materials. And here we have those alternative materials that we selected. Here we have the Reflect Red, and here we have the Matte Cap Sculpey. These come with masks, so I could, like I was saying before, if you are working on a hard surface object, you could render a variety of industrial surfaces and then come in here in the mask that's associated with that layer. Let me go ahead and open Photoshop a bit more here. And then if we paint black into that mask, it removes that material. If we paint white into the mask, it will reveal the material. So that's revealing the material beneath it. So we'll collapse the materials and turn off visibility. And then we have our base layers. And if we open this, we have our preview render. Now the preview render is kind of nice to have there because it doesn't double up on your shadows. So if I turn off both of these, you see, this is my sort of beauty pass. This has all the shadows and everything baked into it. The preview render, if I were to turn my shadows back on, let's turn effects back on, there we go. We can get the shadowing baked into, or we can get the shadowing put on top of our preview layer, like so. So that might be something that you want to experiment with instead of doubling up on the shadows and baking those down into your image. You would also want to make sure that in your preview, you had your translucency, your wax preview set as you wanted it to be seen. Here we have an albedo pass. The albedo pass is just the flat color. And if we select that, you can see it's set to normal, but we could change this to, let's say, overlay, and then dial back the opacity on that, and that will give us just a little bit more punch to the color. Let's turn those lights on, and let's go back into our lighting here, and let's go to the right-hand light there. There you go. So you see that we can start to light this beauty pass using those lights that were rendered out as separate passes. So we've got all this control here that we previously wouldn't have if we were just dealing with a normal layer, especially one that was just everything baked down into a single image. So this is the standard and the ideal way of working, is to have this level of control. Now, like I said, the first time I presented this in my Gnomon Online course, I found it was the first time that the students were kind of confused by the process of compositing, the ones that had not done this before. And I think part of that is because they didn't have the experience of doing it by hand the first time. So hopefully walking through this and explaining what these individual layers are doing helps clarify. But I also want to do a second demonstration in this video where we render these passes out manually and then manually composite them in Photoshop, because it's good to have that ability in your tool set, and I think it just gives a greater degree of understanding of the mechanics of how these compositing layers work. So we'll go back over to Photoshop and we will manually render out some passes. This will be more time consuming. One thing that's really nice about the ZBrush to Photoshop plugin is that it automates this process for you. However, it's not too terribly much longer, so let's give it a go now. Let's go back over to ZBrush. So back in ZBrush, let's go ahead and set this up for manual renders. The first thing I want to do is I want to select the material that I'm using for the skin. In this case, it is the basic material 5. Make sure material is turned on. Make sure that my current subtool is the body, and I will go to color, fill object, and that just fills the object with that material. So that is now baked into that material channel. Now I can tear off my material settings and I can make any necessary adjustments to this. I will keep the specular turned down for now. I can adjust my wax preview. I can turn that up and down as required. Leave specular as it is, and that should be good. Now what I want to do is I want to change my render settings. So I'm going to go to the render settings, go to BPR shadow. Now we already had these set for our previous renders, but I just want to cover the fact that I have the angle under BPR shadow set to 45 and raise set to 38. The idea here is the angle gives us a softer edge to our shadows, and the raise gives us a higher quality shadow. So having those two turned on will give you better shadowing. BPR ambient occlusion, we can adjust the strength on that, but the default is generally fine. I will go to render properties, make sure wax preview is on, and I will make sure ambient occlusion is turned on. This will render an ambient occlusion pass, and it will render the wax preview of my colors here. Now, when I do a best preview render, it will render this pass. We'll get the glass for the eyes and for the drool. We'll get the translucency of the skin and all of our shadows. Now, instead of automatically sending those to Photoshop, we're going to find that these actually end up here in BPR render pass. Here you can see these are render passes that were rendered out by the script earlier. We didn't have ambient occlusion turned on, so we don't have an ambient occlusion pass here. The script did that for us automatically, but now that we've turned it on, we will have one here. So I will go ahead and click BPR, and it's going to do a best preview render, which is the ZBrush render of choice. There's the best render mode, which is rarely used anymore, and then BPR render, which gives you access to many more settings that I generally give you, I think, a better look. But we're going to let this cook. We're going to let this finish because it's going to take a little bit of time, and then we will come back when the render has completed. And here we go. Our render has completed. And we see that we have all of our shadows baked in here in the main render view. But if we go over to this side here, under the render menu, BPR render pass, we have our composite image, which uses the composite of all the layers. We have just a shaded view. We have the depth pass, the shadow pass, ambient occlusion, and a mask. So I want to export these by just clicking on this image swatch here. It opens up a file browser, so I can export here. I'm going to create a folder and we'll call it passes. And I will just keep the default file name. I will change it though to PSD from JPEG, and I will click save, and that saves it automatically as that file name. I'll click the next one and we'll save this with its default file name as a PSD. We'll grab depth next, bring that over here. It's automatically set to PSD because the depth pass is unique, and we'll talk about why that is once we get it into Photoshop. Next, we'll take our BPR shadow, make sure that's a PSD, ambient occlusion, PSD, mask, PSD. Now we're going to manually create a specular pass. Now, the specular pass we're going to do differently this time. We are going to take our material. We'll go to the material menu, scroll down here. We already have it docked on the side of the screen. I'm going to turn my specular up, and that's going to increase the specular quality on the skin. And I'm going to tighten it up a little bit like this, and that's going to give me a stronger specular highlight. Now I'm going to select black as my active color, and I will go to the Z plugin, Subtool Master, Fill, and I want to fill every subtool with color and material. So it will go through each subtool and fill it with this shiny material with a black color. So if I click OK, it'll cycle through each one of them, and it will add that. Now, what this means is we're going to use this as a screen blending mode. And in Photoshop, a screen blending mode will allow the white areas or the light areas to come through, and it will filter out the black areas. So you can end up getting this nice, sharp shine, and then have total control over what areas appear wet or shiny and what areas appear matte. So now it's completed, and we can tweak our lighting if we want, just to make it a little bit sharper. So if I turn off, say, this light here, or if we leave that light on and turn this light off, you can see that we get sort of variations in our specular. That's kind of nice, but I think what I will end up doing here is going to my key light, make sure that's selected, and we're just going to increase it from 1.75. Let's just turn it up a little bit so it's much, much, much brighter. There we go. Now, we don't have to render this one, but when we render BPR images and they save into these swatches here, they're automatically anti-aliased, and they are at this resolution that we set for our document. Because we're not rendering this, we don't get this over here as a pass. What I need to do is manually export it by going to Document, Export, and then exporting a PSD of this. So ZBrush will export the document at whatever size it is on screen. So if I have AA half turned on, which is anti-aliased half-sized, that gives me an anti-aliased version of my image at half the size. So I don't get my full resolution here. So I need to make sure that we are set to actual size, and then we will click Document, Export, and we'll just save this as specular. And we will save that as a PSD. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to create my own clown pass. And I will do that by changing to the flat color material. And let's change to the color white. And we'll once again go to Z plugin, Subtool Master, Fill, and we'll fill color and material on all of our subtools. And then we're just going to manually go from subtool to subtool and fill a different color so we can differentiate one from the other. Remember, this is the mask that we use with the magic wand or the select by color range, so we can isolate parts of our model when we want to paint on them in Photoshop. So we'll leave the body white. We'll go to the teeth, and we're not going to do anything with the teeth just yet. I'm going to turn on frame mode so you can see what we have selected. We'll go to the drool, and we'll make the first drool extraction here. We will turn off frame mode, and let's just select any color. We'll select red. I'll go to RGB, color, fill object, and that fills that with the color red. I'll go to the next subtool down, and we will switch color and just fill that with green. We'll go to the eyes. Now, the eyes, I don't have to worry about the inner eye shell because the outer eye is the thing that we're most concerned about. So I'll select this, and I will fill this with blue. We'll go to our eyelashes. Now we want to put a flat color onto the eyelashes. So we'll just scroll up so we can actually see them, and then zoom out a bit. Now for the eyelashes, I need to come down here to the texture map menu. And here you see the eyelashes have a texture map associated with them. So we'll turn that off, and now we will be able to actually assign colors to these. So go to this one here and just go to color, fill object, and we'll fill that with green. Make sure that our texture map is turned off for that one. There we go. So we can see the green on that now. And we'll go to our last one here. and then go to Color, Fill Object. There we go. So now we've got a color code for all of our eyelashes. Now we want to do our teeth. So let's go back up to the teeth. And because the teeth have individual polygroups on them, it's much, much easier just to go into frame mode. And under the polyframe button here, turn off line. And that will give us just flat colors for the teeth. So now I will click Actual Size, Document, Export, and we'll just call this Mats. And that's saving as a JPEG, so let me cancel that, and we will go to Document Export and save this as Mats PSD. Change our file type to PSD, oops, and then click Save. So now we've manually created these passes. There's one more that I think is really valuable to have, especially if you're working on something that has a lot of details. I'll keep the flat color material selected. I'll go back to white. I will go to Z plugin, fill, and I will fill all of my subtools with a flat color. So replace everything with white. Now, if I scroll up to the top, let it finish. It's actually still going through the fibers there. There we go. Select the body. Make sure that is my active subtool. Turn off frame mode so we don't have a color on there. If I go to masking, mask by cavity right here, open the cavity profile and make sure that the cavity profile curve is straight up and down. It may very well look like this when you first open it. Just click here and click and drag here, and you can make this a straight up and down line. Turn your Z intensity, or your intensity, all the way up. Then we'll click Mask by Cavity, and that's going to create a mask that puts a dark color down into all the recesses and keeps a highlight on all the high points. So this allows us to sort of punch up any sort of wrinkle details or any pore details. Look down here on the chest, we can really see it there. So I will just export this, make sure that it's actual size, document export, and we will call this cavity. You can set your preferred file type in the ZBrush preferences, but sometimes I do prefer to export a JPEG over a PSD if I'm doing something quick or just getting a show image out. So those are our passes. Now we're ready to go to Photoshop, load those into a single document, and then manually set up our layer order and our blending modes. So let's do that now. Now, back in Photoshop, we want to load in those images that we just saved out from ZBrush. I'll go to File, Open, and then I will open all those passes that I just made. I'm just going to shift-click the whole group and then open them. Now that's going to open up each one of those. We'll let those load. They're quite high res, so it might take a little bit of time. There we go. So things like the BPR composite, if we go to image mode, this is RGB color, 8 bits per channel. That's fine. That's what we want. We're going to run a script that puts all of these files together for us into a layered PSD. And for that to work, all the images have to be RGB 8-bit. So all those images that try to default to JPEG, these will already be RGB 8-bit. For example, BPR render, if we go to image mode, this is RGB 8-bit, so that's fine. However, if we get to things like the shadow pass, if we go to image mode, you can see that this is actually multi-channel. So I'll change this to grayscale first, and then that lets me go back to image mode, and now I can access RGB color. And you can see that this is already 8-bit. So I will go ahead and save this with Control S, and then just close it. The depth pass here, this is the outlier. If I go to image mode, it's set to grayscale, so I'll change it to RGB. Then I'll go to image mode, and it's 16-bit. This is very important. If you do not change this to 8-bit, when you load it up into a stack, your entire painting will be a 16-bit image, which can really, really eat up disk space and memory, and you won't have any idea why your files are so gigantic. So we'll save that and close it. Ambient occlusion pass. Here we'll go to image mode, change it to grayscale, and then change it to RGB. And again, that's already 8-bit so there's no need to change that. The mask, I will do the same, change it to grayscale, then change it to RGB. Save and close. Specular will already be RGB 8-bit because that's just a document we exported from ZBrush, so I don't even have to change that. I can just close it. The mattes pass, once again, you see that that's already 8-bit RGB because that's just an image that we manually exported. And the same is true of the cavity pass. Now, we're ready to go into File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. This will bring up this Load Layers script. If I click Browse, it will bring me right back to my passes. I'll just grab all of these and click Open, and then I will click OK. And Photoshop will take each layer, put it into, or each image, put it into a new layer of a new document, and then name that layer for what that file is. And here you see we've got a layer stack. So now let's organize this. The first thing I do is I take what I consider to be utility layers. These are layers that I'm not using for the image itself. These are layers that I'm using to manipulate the image, like mattes and masks and the depth pass. So I'll take mattes, I'll take BPR mask, I will take BPR depth, bring these up to the top, and then I will shift-click these three layers and press Control-G, and that groups them together. And if I double-click the name, I'll just call this Utility. Now I'll turn off visibility on that group. Next, I will take my shadow passes. I will take ambient occlusion on top, shadow underneath that, and I will put the BPR render beneath that. Now that leaves me with specular. I'll take specular and I'll put that between my shadow and my BPR render. Now I'm going to turn off visibility on everything but BPR render and ambient occlusion. If I select ambient occlusion, this is what the ZBrush script did for us. Let's do it manually now. I will change this to multiply. Anything that is a black and white image that you want to sort of punch up lights and darks, you'll use the multiply layer. That's going to darken all the darks. Okay, so there you see we've got our ambient occlusion set to 100%. I can dial this back or dial it up. It gives me total control over that shadow pass. Next, we'll turn on the actual BPR shadow. And once again, we just want to darken with this layer. So we will select multiply. It multiplies the darks by the pixels underneath it. Now, by default, this can be quite strong. So we will dial back the intensity on this. Next, we'll turn on specular. Now, specular is a black and white image as well. But we don't want to use the black in this. We want to use the white to lighten the image. So we will choose the screen blending mode. Now you see we have this total control over our specular. You see how that adds shine to the skin? If I wanted to put a mask on here, I can just Alt-click on this mask icon here and it hides everything. If I just click on it without holding down Alt, it adds a mask, but it doesn't hide anything. Then if I take my paintbrush, I can paint the color white into that mask and I can reveal the shiny bits where I want things to be shiny. I will right-click on that and I will delete layer mask for now. So lastly, let's see how we can use the cavity mask. If I bring the cavity mask above the render for color, turn it on, and then set this to multiply. So by setting the cavity layer to multiply, we get a darker influence that accentuates all the pores and wrinkles. Now it's overstated by default, so we want to dial back our opacity so it's not quite so overwhelming. And it just gives you that little extra punch in those areas. Now, because this is a black and white image, you could also use this as a mask. So if you had a color, let's say, for example, I created a new layer here with Control-Shift-N, and we'll fill this layer with this lavender color we have here. And I will Alt-click to make a mask there. And I will just select my cavity mask, Control-A for select all, Control-C to copy it, and we'll turn off visibility. Now, if I Alt-click on my layer mask here, and if I Control-Shift-V, I can paste my cavity mask into that mask. So if I come back over here, you see now I've got a mask limiting that color, but it's inverted. I want to Control-I while I have the mask selected, and that inverts the effect of that color. And I also want to get rid of the background. I don't want the background to actually be part of this mask. So the easy way to do that is to come up here to my BPR mask, magic wand, select that, then come back and Alt-click on this mask, and then we will just fill that with black. Now, if I click on the color portion of the layer, I can adjust this to be any color I want. So if I press Control U, it'll bring up the hue saturation controls. Turn on colorize, and then we can shift the hue, shift the saturation. And we have total control over what color is being put into the recesses of the cavity mask. Now, these types of edits are destructive in that I can't go back and sort of use the smart filters to undo that. This is actually changing those pixels. So that is one thing that the Zbrush to Photoshop plugin does that's really valuable. It does allow you to revisit these types of changes, and you don't have to really commit to any of them. So moving on. So if we zoom in here, you can see that this color is isolated down into all the little pits and pores and wrinkles of the render. So this is really nice for being able to accentuate details with some color variation. So let's grab something that's more fitting. If I take the brush tool and hold down the Alt key, I can use the eyedropper to sample this warm brown. And then we will just fill that color layer with this warm brown instead of that blue that we had before. So now that we've filled that with a more suitable color, we can turn it on and off, and you can see the effect that it has. And it's very, very overstated. That's one thing about the cavity mask. So we want to turn down that opacity to make it quite subtle. And you can also further paint into the masking to isolate it into just those areas that you want to impact with cavity coloration to accentuate or highlight certain parts of the model. So there's a lot of utilities that you can use the cavity mask for, so it's worth hanging on to and making one of those. So I'll turn on the colorized version and turn this one off, and I will drag it up into the utility group so I can hang on to it for later. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to put a mask on all of these layers to knock out the background. Now I can do this two ways. I can make a mask or I can just delete it. I'll select the BPR mask layer and just magic wand select the background. I don't have to have this as the active layer. As long as I have it selected, I'm selecting pixels from that layer. Now I will go to the top of my group, and I could just press the delete key, and that deletes the background out of these images. I don't mind being destructive in that way, deleting the background, because there's no pixels in there I actually need. If you did have it selected, however, and you came down here where you have add layer mask, if I have a pixel selection and I click that, it's going to create a mask based on my selection. So right now you see it's masking out the body. So if I undo that and instead Alt click, now you see it's taking the background out. That also gets rid of my my selection. So you have to redo your selection each time. I find it easiest in this situation just to come down the list and just delete the background out of all of these images. There we go. Now you see we have a transparent background. I can create a new background with Control-Shift-N. Drag that to the bottom, and we'll just double click it and name it background. And then I can just set a background color here. So let's say we'll make it that 50% gray. Control-A for all, and then let me make sure I've got that as my secondary color, and then fill that. Or you could also just go to the paint bucket icon and fill it that way. The important thing is that we have a background that is separate from our character. So this is how we can manually put together our own composites. There was a lot of information. It might have been a little bit overwhelming, and you might look at that and think, oh gosh, that's not worth the trouble. I'd rather use the plugin. That's totally valid. Like I said, I just want you to be able to do this on your own if you want to have that information, because I do think it comes in handy. And after you've done it a few times, it doesn't take that much effort. If I'm not talking about this and describing how to do it, I can render passes out and get a base composite together to paint on top of in about 15 minutes, 10 minutes. It doesn't really take a long time. And also, if you understand how to work with the pieces and parts, how to isolate areas and grab areas out of different ZBrush renders, you can go back into ZBrush and select other materials for various subtools and then start to mix and match things. One last bit of housekeeping. I'm going to select all these groups and Control-G, group those together, and I'm going to call that working layers. And I will Control G for the background and just call this background, because we may very well put more elements into our background. And we can get rid of this BPR composite, or we can just put that in the utilities group. And now we are done. I will Control Shift S, and I will save this as comp bogey lady _01. And I will save that into the files for the downloads for this video, so you can open that in Photoshop and look at how that's organized if you've missed anything or you're not quite clear on what the blending modes should be. So I hope you found this video helpful. One of my favorite things to do with ZBrush is to render out imagery and then further adjust it and paint on top of it in Photoshop. I really enjoy that process, and the design phase always does continue into Photoshop, where I find myself tweaking and adjusting and adding new bits and pieces. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.